We recognize that Berkeley sits on the Kuchu territory, the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone people, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. This land every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and the occupation of the land since the institution's founding in 1868. By offering this land acknowledgement, the Berkeley community not only recognizes the history of the land on which we stand, but also recognizes that the Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. So again, thank you for allowing me to make that land acknowledgement. Yes?
There's some real loud soundtracks sort of infiltrating.
Oh, really? Shut this down. That's helpful.
Thank you.
We have the Beatles in the background today. Well, I'll give you a little bit of introduction to Science of Psychedelics. Thank you, by the way. Thank you for interrupting me. Always feel free to do that. In 2008, Science of Psychedelics was envisioned as a unified effort to raise public awareness, understanding, and appreciation of science research at UC Berkeley. To realize this vision, we engaged the vast Berkeley science, technology, engineering, and mathematics community to foster creative collaborations among campus and within community-based groups who share a commitment to equity and inclusion in STEM education and in STEM careers. Science at Cal connects researchers with a diverse community of groups of all ages and backgrounds for science engagement and science learning. Accessibility, inclusiveness, creativity, and innovations are hallmarks of Science at Cal events, which reach tens of thousands of people annually. Throughout the year, Science at Cal presents ongoing, free, always free, outreach programs on and off campus. You'll see in just a moment. We help promote other related efforts across campus and within the community, and we create programs and initiatives at Berkeley, again, both in and outside the Berkeley community. Our broad scope of activities is made possible by Science at Cal's dynamic network of campus alliances and valuable community partnerships. As you see here, cafes, lectures, festivals. We work with consulates, libraries, First Fridays, we're at farmers markets, community centers, artists. We want to thank first and foremost Berkeley Community Media in the corner. Give them a round of applause. Community Media records these sessions and put them on YouTube, so you all get them after the event. Share them with friends, watch them again, do whatever you want with them, really. So please check out our YouTube channel. We also want to thank Science at Cal's Advisory Council. I don't think so, but do we have any Advisory Council members in the audience right now? I didn't think so. Shame, they're missing a good one. We also want to thank UC Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost who fund Science at Cal, so this would not be possible without their support. The Lawrence Hall Science who manages our program, and also all of our donors. This again would not be possible without the folks in the audience who donate today or who donated in the past. If you want to learn more about donating and how you can help Science at Cal, again, we really want to make sure that we're reaching all communities far and wide, especially disadvantaged and marginalized communities. And to do that, we really need the support of everyone who can help us. So if you want to learn more about how you can help us, please do, or if you want to donate directly, there's the QR code for you again. We're going to be out tomorrow. We will be out and about at the Solano Stroll. Look for our booth. We'll be there with the Lawrence Hall Science. We'll have a slew of scientists out there doing hands-on and activities with folks in the public. You can not just talk to Michael today, you'll talk to a bunch of scientists tomorrow if you make it out. We have all of our programs planned for the fall. We have Why Don't Poison Frogs Poison Themselves in October. And then we have an astronomer who's going to talk about some Webb telescope connections to UC Berkeley. So that also should be exciting. Stay tuned. Our Midday Science Cafes are all virtual and are at lunch on Thursdays, the third Thursday of every month. Join us. We have some outer spaces, hottest and brightest objects next week. Next week, we have all about animals, and we have the road to vehicle electrification. This is the event that's going to be next week. scientists who speak Spanish. Our next Caminos de la Ciencia is materials in extreme condition, a window to the interior of planets. We also are just starting up again our Grounds for Science, which features graduate students. If there's any grad students in the audience, or if you know of any grad students, or if you want to watch some grad students strut their stuff and talk about their research, we will be at Caffeinated in North Berkeley. So please join us for those events as well. We'll also, I think this is the last one, guys. We'll be at Dia de los Muertos in Fruitvale. So come join us. We'll be at the festival. We'll be there again with some scientists, many of which who will be speaking Spanish. That was a lot. You're not here to listen to me, but what I have to do my job and share with you all about what Science Psychedelics is, what we do, and how we're out and about in the community. So I will go ahead right now and introduce the speaker. Michael Silver is the director of the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. Initial psychedelic research studies in his lab involve administration of psilocybin, a psychoactive component of magic mushrooms, to human subjects in order to characterize their neurobiological, perceptual, and cognitive aspects of the psychedelic experience. A central goal of this research is to use psychedelics to obtain insights into the workings of the human mind and brain and their capacity to change. Michael Silver is also a professor of optometry and vision science and neuroscience at UC Berkeley. His laboratory research is focused on understanding how the human brain constructs representations of visual environment and how these representations are altered by cognitive processes such as attention, expectation, and learning. Fascinating. His team seeks to better understand how the brain activity constructs these visual representations by using a combination of perceptual brain imaging, computational modeling, and pharmacological techniques. So let's welcome Dr. Michael Silver to the stage. Make sure they're questions that can be answered quickly during the talk, because we will have a half an hour of Q&A at the very end of the talk that you'll be able to really ask rich and discussion-based questions. So again, if you have questions during the talk, just raise your hand. Michael will call on you, but we'll try to leave those to questions that are sort of pertinent to moving on, okay? All right, thanks everybody.
All right. Thank you, Dee, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone involved in organizing the Science at Cal program for inviting me to share with you some information about our Berkeley Psychedelic Center. Just amazed at the scope and ambition of the Science at Cal program. Such a wonderful set of activities. Thanks also to Berkeley Community Media for volunteering to record this today. I'm very grateful for that. And thanks to all of you for being inside here with me on a beautiful Saturday to learn more about our Psychedelic Center. So our center is relatively new. We were founded just 2 years ago on the Berkeley campus. And we have three main pillars that kind of organize our various programs and activities. The first is research. So this includes research in both human subjects and experimental animal models. And research projects are on the effects of psychedelics and the mechanisms of these effects in the brain and body. And I will talk much more about this in much more detail. We have a training program that literally just started a few days ago with our first cohort. And this is training people to be facilitators or guides of the psychedelic experience of others. And finally, public education, providing objective science-based information for society in an area that has had a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And this involves public education offerings, online courses, our website, and also journalistic activities. And I'll talk a lot more about that as well. So a founding principle of our center from the very beginning has been the commitment to representing many different disciplines and really integrating these disciplines to the best of our ability. So our executive committee, which is a group of 6 faculty that do most of the center's operations, span all of these different units on our campus: psychology, molecular and cell biology, education, journalism, optometry, and neuroscience, and we're looking to expand further into the humanities and social sciences eventually. So from its very beginning, the center has been committed to interdisciplinarity and synergism across different disciplines. I'll start talking about our research pillar now. So a little bit about psychedelics. Why are they an interesting topic to research, or why are they relevant? Why are they important? So one area that you've probably all heard about is clinical trials involving psychedelic-assisted therapy to treat patients with PTSD, depression, anxiety, et cetera. Many of these patients come from groups that modern psychiatry has really failed and just has no real effective treatments. And psychedelic-assisted therapy seems to provide an alternative for at least some of these people to not just sort of manage their symptoms, but to truly undergo transformations that reduce their suffering in a long-lasting way. So here's just one example of a study from last year involving administration of MDMA or ecstasy together with therapy with patients who were suffering from PTSD. And sorry if the fonts are small, but the blue, so the y-axis here is a clinical rating score for the severity of PTSD. And then the x-axis is different sessions before the treatment starts, and then various time points just after the treatment, and then with a follow-up time point. And blue is the participants who received a placebo and therapy, and the red line are participants who received MDMA together with therapy. And you can see there's a much greater reduction in the symptoms and the suffering of these patients when MDMA is combined with therapy in this clinical trial. And so this is with phase 3 of the FDA process of testing new drugs for approval by the FDA as medicines. And so it's anticipated, if the data continue to look like this, that MDMA will likely be approved by the FDA as a medicine for the treatment of PTSD in the next couple of years, maybe even sooner. So, yes? Usually dozens. Oh, yes, thank you. Dee coached me on this, and I forgot the very first time. The question is, what's the sample size of the participants in these trials? And this is something that has developed over years as the standards and rigor of these studies has improved. But usually it's dozens. It's a couple dozen, a few dozen, up to, let's say, 100 or so is typically the largest, which is not nearly as large as some of the sample sizes for other kinds of pharmaceutical trials. But on the other hand, the amount of human effort for these trials is also very large. So it's not just giving people MDMA and then putting them in a room and kind of watching them. It's intensive therapy. There's preparatory sessions. There's integration sessions, which are thought to be very important for taking whatever lessons or experiences that come up during the psychedelic experience and really kind of bringing them into the participants' everyday life. And so they're very expensive to do, and that just puts kind of like practical constraints on the sample sizes. Thanks for the question. So it's really exciting that there's this potentially new way of treating a variety of mental health disorders. But the reality is we have almost no understanding of how this is happening in the brain. What is actually changing in the brain of someone who is depressed and does psilocybin-assisted therapy and then has less depression for years afterwards? So that's a goal of our center, not necessarily to study participants with mental health disorders, but just to understand what do psychedelics do in the brain? How do they change brain activity, representations, the way the brain processes information? Can that give us insights into how psychedelic-assisted therapy works and ultimately help us to develop more precise and effective treatments? The second bullet point here is psychedelics reliably increase neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is very broadly defined. It really means any change in the brain at any level. It could be synaptic changes, circuit changes, anatomical, functional changes. But in every model system that it's been studied, psychedelics increase plasticity. And so we would like to understand that better, again, with the goal of not just making discoveries about the brain, which is valuable in and of itself, but then to use that information to be able to design new therapies that are more effective in the future. Psychedelics are also really fascinating outside of the domain of mental health treatments and clinical trials. Studies in people without any kind of diagnosis have shown that people who have psychedelic experiences often rate these experiences as some of the most meaningful of their entire lives. And so that's what this graph shows here. The axis is the percent of participants that rated their psychedelic experience in this case as being one of the five most spiritually significant experiences of their lives. So participants in the study are rating their psychedelic experience comparable to a birth of a child or a death of a parent or these really transformative, meaningful life experiences. So it's just a fascinating phenomenon that you can take a small amount of a compound or a drug or a mushroom and have an experience of this intensity and impact. And we also really have no idea about how that happens in the brain. So this is obviously related to the transformative experiences that patients in clinical trials undergo, but it's not unique to people with mental health disorders. And, it's very commonly experienced by anybody who has a high-dose psychedelic experience. So we're interested in understanding that better. And then finally, psychedelics are just a really useful research tool for understanding basic mechanisms of the mind and the brain and the body. So for any kind of complex system, if you can have a well-defined experimental manipulation, if you will, that perturbs the system and then look to see how the system is different, that's been a very valuable way of understanding cells and synapses and networks of neurons and all sorts of other phenomena as well. And so in this case, psychedelics are really a way for us to probe the basic fundamental properties of perception, cognition, emotion, et cetera, by using them as a research tool. So the history of psychedelic research is checkered, to say the least. I would argue that psychedelic research in some forms has been happening for millennia, and mostly in indigenous societies, and would necessarily kind of frame it as research in the way that Western scientists talk about research, but certainly indigenous groups have learned a tremendous amount about the psychoactive properties of animals, plants, and fungi. They've learned a tremendous amount about the kinds of environments or interactions that give rise to different kinds of psychedelic experiences and long-lasting outcomes. And so that kind of work, there's a very rich source of indigenous science and knowledge that is really the foundation for a lot of the work that's happening now in Western universities and medical schools and so forth. Looking at things more from a Western science framework, LSD was first synthesized in the late 30s, was understood to be a psychedelic or a powerful psychoactive substance in the 40s. And then mescaline was isolated. Mescaline is the active component in peyote cactus or San Pedro cactus. That was first isolated chemically in 1897. And then psilocybin, as Dee mentioned, the active component in psychedelic mushrooms, psilocybic mushrooms, in 1939. Sorry, 1959. And then there was a lot of appreciation very early on, actually, among clinicians and therapists and psychiatrists, that a lot of these drugs had a lot of potential for treating alcoholism and depression and other mental health disorders. And it was understood also that the drug itself was really not the whole story, that it's the drug in combination with the set of the participant or the patient, set meaning their intention, why are they taking the drug in the first place, that interacts powerfully with the pharmacological actions of the drug, and then the setting, the environment in which it takes place, the people who are around, the physical environment. These are really important factors in the psychedelic experience, and this is obviously was understood very early on by many indigenous groups, but also in this more clinical, formal setting, understood as being important modulators of the potential for these drugs to be mental health treatments. And so that was in the 1950s and 1960s. These were even smaller sample sizes. A lot of these studies wouldn't really hold up to the kind of modern standards of scientific rigor, but still, there's a lot of promise and excitement about the possibility of a mental health revolution at that time. And then, so really at that point in the US, psychedelics were more or less limited to therapists and medical practitioners. They weren't really so widespread in popular culture. But then in the 1960s, they became used by all sorts of different groups for all sorts of reasons, spiritual, religious, recreational. And this led to the importance of psychedelics in the 60s counterculture. So the psychedelics kind of escaped the lab and became much more of a social phenomenon with really insufficient information about the risks of these drugs and questions about set and setting and so forth. They were used very widely in a way that was really not accompanied by very much education about what these experiences were all about and what sorts of things people maybe would want to be thinking about before having these experiences. So this scared a lot of people in our society, and it was seen as a threat to our society by some and by the sort of the order of our society. It was obviously very much tied up with counterculture movements in other ways in the 1960s. And eventually, the Controlled Substances Act was signed in 1972. This is Richard Nixon signing the document. So this created a system of schedules of various levels of restrictions, legal restrictions on different compounds. LSD and psilocybin were both placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive schedule. And this, the definitions of this are that there's no currently accepted medical use for these compounds, which just was objectively not the case given all of the research that had taken place before then. But that is in fact their legal status, and then high potential for abuse. And the combination of those is what defines Schedule 1 substances, the most restricted. And so this obviously made it illegal to possess, consume, distribute these drugs with very severe criminal penalties associated for breaking those laws. But it also had a really strong effect on research. It became next to impossible to do any kind of research, certainly with human subjects, on these compounds when they were in this legal category. And so all of the excitement of the potential for psychedelics as ways to understand the mind and the brain and for treating mental health, it really stalled for decades because of the legal restrictions and the challenges of doing research with these compounds. So this started to change, I would say, in the 1990s, really. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico did some studies on DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is a naturally occurring compound in some plants and actually in mammals as well. We all have DMT in our nervous systems. Despite it being the most restricted controlled substance, we are all making it as we speak in this room. And this really opened the door and kind of established there's a process for getting regulatory approvals to get permission to do this kind of research. So we have a lot to thank Rick Strassman and his colleagues for that way. And then more and more, there have been these clinical trials that are sponsored by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to test for the efficacy and safety of these drugs in conjunction with therapy for all of these mental health disorders. There's also been a lot of research on the relationships between psychedelics and spiritual experience. As I mentioned, so the psychedelic experience is often ranked as one of the top spiritual experiences that people have in their lifetime. And so there's a lot of work that's gone into characterizing that and trying to understand it a little more deeply. And as I mentioned, psychedelics are also just really useful tools for neurobiologists and psychologists to be able to kind of turn the levers of the mind and brain and see how the people and systems respond to that. So our focus at the BCSP is really on basic mechanistic research. We want to understand how these drugs work in the brain and the body and on the mind. So it's different than a lot of the clinical work that's going on, where there's a particular patient population, and the goal of the study is to establish or determine whether a combination of drug and therapy is an effective treatment for that group. That's very important work, but it doesn't really provide any insight into the mechanisms. And also at Berkeley, our strengths are really basic science and neuroscience. We don't have a medical school here in the clinical facilities, and so it makes a lot more sense for us to focus on our strengths and to use psychedelics as research tools for this basic kind of research. And so we're starting with three very broadly conceived kinds of projects that all involve psilocybin. In some cases, we'll be looking at other psychedelics. But the first kind is low-dose experiments, where we're administering psilocybin to human subjects, and we're interested in characterizing the psychedelic experience itself. So during the time that people have the drug in their body and are experiencing whatever this low dose engenders in them, we are making measurements of their perception, their cognition. We're going to put them in brain scanners and measure their brain activity. And so obviously it's important that the dose is low enough that it's ethical and realistic for people to be present and to be focused on these boring computer tasks and hold their head still in the scanner and so forth. And this is really hoping, we're going to give a description of the perceptual and cognitive aspects of the psychedelic experience through this work. We are also very interested in hydro studies that are much more, the ego dissolution, really transformative, powerful experiences. And there, we're not really looking to study people while they're in the midst of this high dose experience, but rather making measurements before the experience and then at time points afterwards. And we're really asking, what does the psychedelic experience change in a more long-lasting, enduring way in people? And so this involves a lot of support from trained therapists and monitors, both before the psychedelic experience, during, and then afterwards as well. And the goal here is to look at effects on emotion, stress regulation, and inflammation. Again, not in patient populations with mental health disorders diagnoses, but in so-called neurotypicals. Yes? So I should say these are all at the stage of proposal and getting through the regulatory approvals. Question is, what dose are we using? Thank you. These experiments are not yet underway. We actually hope to start in a few months, but the proposals are 10 milligrams of psilocybin for the low dose and 25 milligrams for the high dose in human subjects. Yes? Yes, definitely. So the question is, do we have exclusionary criteria for the participants in our studies? So, we are informed by the previous work on the kinds of people who are at risk to have bad reactions and maybe even long-term consequences, negative consequences of psychedelic experience. So we have extensive mental health screening and then also physiological medical screening to make sure that we're minimizing the risk to these participants. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about that later on. Yes? Are we growing our own? Well, let's turn off the recording sound. No. No, this is all, the challenge of this work is, compared to other similar experiments involving drugs and studying the mind and brain, is the amount of regulatory approval that's required because they are so controlled. So the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, inspects every research facility. They want to see what kind of safe you have, what your record keeping is, making sure there's no diversion of the material. The compound that we use is to be pharmaceutical grade. So we can't just buy psilocybin from a chemical company, for example. It has to be at the same level that you would have for a drug that you would get prescribed as a medicine by your doctor. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they also have to approve every protocol that we do, just as though it were a clinical trial by one of the big pharmaceutical companies to bring a new drug to market. And then we have a human subjects board here that is reviewing all of our protocols, looking for safety and confidentiality issues and so forth. There's also a state review board that reviews all protocols on controlled substances. So this is very carefully monitored by a number of government agencies. And so it's very much by the book, as it should be. Yes? How are we planning to administer the drug? So we have a supplier who is able to make pharmaceutical-grade psilocybin, and so we will just get capsules. The drug will be packaged in standardized doses. Just that part is similar to how you would get a prescription at a drugstore through your doctor.
And did you say your first trial would be
No, actually with people who have no diagnosis, just normal healthy volunteers. Yeah.
how do you control like the outcome based on the background of these people? Make sure that the drug is what
Yeah, okay, so I skipped one of the questions. The questions is, are we looking at patient populations? And we're not. We're starting our studies with people without a diagnosis, healthy volunteers. And we're interested in differences in personality types or cognitive styles and so forth, how the psychedelic experience actually affects that. So that's, I would say, an explicit goal of our research is to relate individual differences along a variety of dimensions with what the character of the psychedelic experience is and with what the long-term effects are. So we're not trying to actually get rid of that. We're trying to highlight it and have it be a factor in our study. Yes?
What measures do you have in place to ensure the privacy of study participants?
What measures do we have in place to ensure the privacy of our participants? And do you mean the privacy of the identity being released or more about the confidentiality of the data that we collect?
Both.
So the answer is both. We have very extensive confidentiality procedures, encryption of data and so forth, anonymization of study documents, and then our institutional review board on our campus requires us to document exactly how we are caring for the data to make sure that it doesn't get released or shared with someone who it shouldn't be shared with. So everyone who gets to see the data is vetted by our university as being one of the study team. And that, I guess that also is the answer for the identity of the subjects as well. That's treated as a piece of data, essentially, from our perspective in terms of the study records. Yeah. Yes?
Well, I understand the necessity for synthesized psilocybin to be used in pure form as we start this research. Can you speak to the possibility of comparing that with the mushroom itself and specific strains and the differences there? Will that be possible?
Question is, even though we're starting with purified a single chemical compound, this is coming from an organism that has many other compounds, some of which may be psychedelic as well. And are we planning on comparing that to, for example, the mushroom that's got not just psilocybin, but many other related compounds as well? I think it's fascinating, and it's one of these kind of practical decisions that we make, for the benefit of, first of all, just getting approval from the FDA, who's much more comfortable working with medicines than they are with intact plants and plant extracts and so forth, fungal extracts. And also just scientifically, it's more controlled. If we know exactly there's one compound, we know exactly the dose. But it's very interesting, the differences between the isolated compound and the organism, and many people think there really are important differences subjectively in taking those two. So I would say that's a long-term research goal of us and many in the field, but it's daunting to think about how to actually get approval to do a study like that anytime soon. Yes? How are we selecting initial subjects? I guess it depends on the study, but we will have open recruitment in mechanisms that are really trying to reach a wide variety of people. So I guess I should take a step back. There's kind of a tradition or a practice that many research studies on a college campus, they end up enrolling participants that are students at the campus or staff members or even their own colleagues. And so one thing that we were very concerned about is we would like our study population to be representative of the society that we live in as many different factors as we can. And so we want a diverse population that really is truly representative. So we will be flyering, we'll be posting on Craigslist. We also have a very particular connection with our training program that the participants of our training program who are learning to be psychedelic guides, most of the training programs, they can get certified to be psychedelic guides without ever having their own psychedelic experience, which seems kind of odd, but understandable given the legal landscape. And so we can actually provide our trainees with safe, monitored psychedelic experiences by having them be participants in our research studies. And so that, first of all, is probably very useful for their training, but then also gives them an introduction to how scientific research is done. That's also an important part of their training. So the recruitment is still, I would say, under development, but that's certainly one goal, is to integrate our research and training programs in that way. Thank you. Yeah, so the question is basically, what are we actually going to do? What kind of measures, quantitative, qualitative? Are we looking over a short amount of time, a long amount of time? I will get into that now with the next few slides. And if there's other questions that you have, please feel free to ask after that. Okay, so on this slide, I think I have not talked about the animal experiments. So these are being headed up by faculty member Andrea Gomez. This is really understanding how does psychedelics increase plasticity at the cellular and molecular level. So looking at things like RNA splicing, synaptic physiology, anatomical changes in the brain. So administering psilocybin to mice and then doing analysis on their brain tissue afterwards. So one of the things we're really interested in terms of research is this concept of predictive coding. And so this is a way of thinking about how perception happens in the brain. So our kind of everyday experience is that our eyes are kind of like cameras. We just point them around wherever we are. We get an image in our consciousness, and that's the way a camera works as well. You take a picture and you see whatever's out there. And that's really an illusion. Perception is a very active, constructive process, and we really build our perceptions in the brain. And the idea about how this happens is that we are constantly making predictions about what's going to happen in the world, or what is out there in the world even. So I can save my brain a lot of computation by assuming that all of you in your seats are going to be in your seats a second from now, instead of recomputing that and regenerating it every single second. And other kinds of assumptions or predictions that our brain makes is if something's moving, it's likely to continue moving in that trajectory. There's examples like we assume when we're interpreting a scene that light is coming from above versus from below. And so all of these are happening under the hood. We're not really aware of them, but they're really important factors in how we perceive the world. And we're very interested in how psychedelics influence this process. So here's just one quick example. These are two images. They're exactly the same image, but each one's flipped with respect to the other. So the image is ambiguous in terms of depth. So you see the one on the left as a mound on top of, or I'm sorry, a crater on top of a mound. The one on the right is you perceive as a mound at the bottom of a crater. But actually, neither one, both interpretations are available just based on the image for both of these. And the reason they doesn't seem ambiguous to us is because of this predictive coding. Our brain is basically just deciding, well, not really sure about how all this fits together, but if I assume that light's coming from above, which is a very safe assumption in most natural environments, then it disambiguates the image. And so this is actually happening all the time, and it's a huge part of how we actually do perceive the world, are making these predictions, and the brain compares these predictions to sensory information. So in the interest of time, I'll skip over a lot of the specifics of this theory we're testing, but the basic idea is that psychedelics reduce the dependence on these predictions. They reduce the power of these predictions in our brain. And in the context of mental health disorders, one of the predictions might be the kind of the narratives and stories that people who are depressed tell themselves. They think, I'm depressed, I don't have worth, I'm not going to be successful, and so that makes them withdraw from society, not try to achieve their goals in life. That leads to more depression, and so you have these kind of vicious circles. And so a prediction in this case is an internally generated narrative about people's self-identity, self-image. And the idea is that together with therapy, psychedelics can reduce the dependence on these predictions or these priors, and then with a skilled therapist can rebuild new priors that are healthier and more adaptive. Now this is, I think, a very compelling, interesting theory, but super hard to study in the brain when you're talking about what's the neural basis of people's self-narratives. In the visual system, which is the area that my lab has expertise in, we understand that part of the brain very well, and we can map out particular areas. We have really good experimental tools for isolating different parts of perception. So the idea is to take this theory that's been used to try to understand how psychedelic-assisted therapy is useful for mental health, and then test it in a rigorous way in a part of the brain that we know well in normal, healthy volunteers. Yes? Each one is flipped vertically with respect to the other. So they're actually the same image, just one's upside down. Or, which one's upside down? It depends on your perspective, I guess, but one of them's upside down. So this work is done in collaboration with Robin Carhart-Harris, who's the inventor of this rebus theory at UC San Francisco. And so this is the brain imaging part. We're going to give people a low dose of psilocybin or a placebo, and then measure activity in their brain as they're perceiving different kinds of visual stimuli, trying to quantify the strength of predictive coding or predictions in the brain and how it affects sensory information. So here's an example of the kind of stimulus we might use. So if you look at that, probably most of you are seeing 4 red lines moving up and down. That's one valid perceptual interpretation. Lost my cursor. Now on the right is actually the same 4 lines, but now they're these blue bars. And we're interpreting those blue bars as an occluder, as something that's actually between us and the red lines. It's not, right? It's in the same image as the red lines. But now they don't seem like 4 lines anymore. Now they seem like 4 components of a grouped image that's moving back and forth. And so this is an example of how our predictions or our assumptions influence the way that we interpret the information. The red lines, pixel for pixel, are exactly the same in these 2 cases. And actually, if you look at the one on the right for a while, you can kind of go back on the left and see, oh, wait a minute, now those actually look different than they did before. And now they do look like a shape moving back and forth. So this is the kind of thing that if you were a participant in our study, you'd be in the brain scanner looking at these, reporting whether you're seeing the elements moving independently or whether you're seeing them grouped. The grouping involves a prediction, a prior, that when you see a person running behind a picket fence, what you're really seeing are like little slices of person between the posts of the fence, but that's not our experience of it. We can kind of sew it all together and see an actual person there. That's an example of priors being used. And so that's the goal of this first study, is to really characterize this at the neurobiological level. The question is, how is prior knowledge affected by set and setting? That is an extremely complex and rich problem that has many, many different dimensions. So set and setting themselves are very, a set for one person having a psychedelic experience might be, I want to have fun at a rave with my friends. Another one might be, I'm suffering from depression and I have to find a treatment that's effective for me, or it could be in a ritualistic setting. So those are sets in terms of like the intentions that people bring to it. So we don't have a lot of control for that. I mean, our set is people who are interested in participating in research, who are going to be in this academic environment, this laboratory environment. But in practice, the range of sets and settings will massively affect how priors happen in the brain and how they interact with other kinds of information processing. And actually, Robin at UCSF, that's one of his studies, is explicitly varying different kinds of environmental factors during the psychedelic experience to try to get a more kind of quantitative, rigorous understanding of set and setting. But in our hands, we're just trying to kind of standardize as much as possible in this highly contrived laboratory setting. It's a weird place to have a psychedelic experience, to be sure. All right. Another study that we're doing, which also involves low-dose administration, is with Jack Gallant in our psychology and neuroscience groups on campus. So this is way too small for you to see, but it's just an illustration of the kind of data that come out of this. And so he's developed really sophisticated tools in his lab for modeling the representations of very small pieces of brain tissue non-invasively in a brain scanner. So the brain is recorded in a way that signals can be obtained from cubes of tissue that are about 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters in size. And then there's an extensive model about many different factors. So in this example, this is people who are hearing stories read to them in the scanner. And there's many, many factors about the semantic and thematic and emotional content of the stories. And you can actually then say, well, for this tiny little cube of tissue, which components of the stories are being represented by this? And so that's, his lab is famous for doing that with movies and with music and with many different kinds of kind of naturalistic stimuli. So it's a really powerful technique to apply to psychedelics. We can map all of these dimensions out for visual dimensions, emotional, semantic, more kind of abstract dimensions, and then say, well, for every single spot in the brain, how do the representations change after psilocybin has been administered? And this gives us a very rich, descriptive kind of dictionary, really, of all of the different ways that the brain's representation is changing along these hundreds and hundreds of factors. So that's another one of our first studies that we'll be starting later this year. The high-dose studies are more about the long-lasting transformative effects. So here we're really interested in, for days to weeks to months after the psychedelic experience, high-dose experience, what are the changes in immune system function, in cognition, in perception, in emotional regulation. And so this is being headed up by Dr. Keltner in psychology. And many of you probably know him. He does a lot of work on awe, the emotional state of awe. And his hypothesis in this case is that that's actually a big part of why the psychedelic experience is so profound and impactful, is that it's a very reliable way of inducing awe. And there are other ways of inducing awe in religious settings, or being in the redwoods, or having a really meaningful interaction with someone who's close to you. But he has very well-developed measures of awe. And so the idea is to basically relate those to how much awe does someone have in a psychedelic experience, and then how predictive is that of whatever the psychedelic experience has changed in them in a more long-lasting way. AWE, yes, awe. Like awesome. Okay, finally, animal experiments. I talked about this a little bit. This is headed by Andrea Gomez. Very rigorous mechanistic study, so she's an expert in RNA splicing and cellular physiology and anatomical measures. And so this is going to be really important information at the level of cells and synapses and molecules about how psychedelics are actually manifesting. Okay, so that's an overview of our initial research projects. I'd also like to talk about our training program. So this is a program for training facilitators of the psychedelic experience, or guides of the psychedelic experience. So we're looking at FDA approval of psychedelic-assisted therapy, and if that happens, there's so many people suffering from mental health disorders in our country, there will be a huge demand for people who have the training to do psychedelic-assisted therapy in a competent and ethical way. And there just aren't enough of those, and the fact is there's very little regulation of any kind on the training programs that exist, and what do you need, what credentials do you actually need, or qualifications do you need to be a psychedelic facilitator? So this is more well-defined in the context of the clinical trials, but once this becomes something that any doctor can prescribe to their patient, there's anticipated for tens of thousands of therapists that will be needed just for the medical part of this. And then you're, I'm sure, all aware of these decriminalization and legalization efforts in Oregon and various cities, and that's going to, if those continue, there will be psychedelic experiences available to people completely outside of a mental health or clinical setting. And so those people will very often benefit from guides and facilitators as well. So we're going to need a lot of people who are able to do this, and that's partly what we want to do as a center, is have a training program that will realistically just be a drop in the ocean in terms of the number of people we train, but hopefully be an example to many other training programs and help to set standards in the field about what a training program should look like for psychedelic facilitation. So an important part of this is Tina Trujillo is an education professor, so she's got years of experience in evaluating educational programs. And so that's an explicit part of what we're doing, is she will be doing evaluation iteratively to improve the program, but then also to share the results of her evaluation research with the world to help to standardize practice here. Yes?
It's my understanding that you're only accepting
The question is about who is eligible for the training program, and we're starting with people who are well established in their fields. That field can be psychedelic chaplaincy, it could be a minister, it could also be a healthcare professional, a nurse, a social worker. So it's diverse that way, but the idea is that we are a small program. We only have 24 students in our cohort. We want them to be able to go and disseminate the knowledge and practice that they get in a meaningful way. And so we're selecting at this time for people who are already very established and have strong kind of presence in their field to be able to disseminate. Yes? Yeah, so the question is about FDA approval and how difficult it is. And almost every medicine that is a prescription medicine has been developed by a pharmaceutical company with massive amounts of resources. And these clinical trials are very expensive, and the FDA has a very specific process that you have to follow. And psychedelics are a very notable exception. So none of them have been FDA approved, but they're at the doorstep. And it's all been philanthropy. Most of it for the psychedelics has been the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. And they've been working at this literally for decades now, and it's all donation-based. And so, part of the reason the pharmaceutical companies aren't so interested, obviously there's social stigma that's a factor, but also a lot of these are naturally occurring compounds, or they're not patented anymore. And so the pharmaceutical companies, they want a return on their investment. And so it's remarkable how much has been accomplished without this huge industry so far. And that's a big question in the field. Now there's a lot of investment from corporations in psychedelics, and they see the potential value of making money. And so that's very much an active kind of dynamic part of the field, and an open question about to what extent psychedelics will be really different in how FDA approval is obtained, or will they be subsumed into this more kind of typical capitalist pharmaceutical model? Yes?
What kind of data do you collect from these experiments? How do you quantify the effect of psychedelics on the brain?
The question is, what are our actual experimental measures? So that depends on the study, but the brain scanner obviously is a measure of brain activity. It doesn't measure neural activity exactly, but it's a proxy for patterns of activity in the brain. We also do these perceptual measurements. So if you were participating in the study, you'd be reporting, for example, when you see the element kinds of motion versus the grouped motion. So people's reports of their perception in real time. There's surveys. There are physiological measures such as recording electrical activity through scalp electrodes or through the autonomic nervous system, so measures of the peripheral activity in the nervous system. So it just depends on the study. But there's a challenge in neuroscience and psychology, which is how do you actually study subjective experience and consciousness? It's sort of by definition the thing that's hardest for science to get to, which is science is based on objective measurements. And so by having people reporting their experiences through surveys, questionnaires, tasks, and so forth, and then combining that with biological measurements, we're hoping to be able to link those two. Yes? How widespread is the use of psychedelics? So you'd have to be more specific about the type of use. So now it's, yeah. So really the only way to legally ingest psychedelics now is either by being in a research trial, and usually these clinical trials with mental health populations, or there's some religious exemptions. So there's some religious groups that have permission to use psychedelics as a sacrament as part of their spiritual practice. So, sorry? Ketamine. Thank you, yeah. So ketamine it's not Schedule I, but it is approved as a medicine, and doctors can prescribe it for actually a variety of conditions. So there are many, many more people that are using ketamine than other psychedelics. But of course, there's a lot of underground illegal use for all sorts of purposes, and that's notoriously hard to measure. So I'm not quite sure where your question is directed, but yeah. So very small now, but if it has FDA approval, then that will open it up to really anybody whose doctor thinks that it's recommended for whatever condition they have. Condition they have that's been approved by the FDA. Yeah, so there's definitely studies on, especially now with this influx of capital from psychedelic companies, there are many, many disorders. I mean, just about any disorder you can think of, someone is interested in seeing if psychedelics are effective and is testing it. Question in the back, yes? I think the question is, for our studies, we're enrolling participants of our training program.
Are you seeing whether a guide having or not having a psychedelic experience affects their efficacy as a guide?
I see. The question is, having a psychedelic experience, is that going to be beneficial or affect the way that guides, the effectiveness of guides as guides?
I find it hard to believe a guide who didn't know. First off, you haven't had a psychedelic, you really can't quite imagine what it's like. And I can't quite imagine a guide guiding somebody who's having one, who himself or herself doesn't know what it is.
Yeah, so I think it's an excellent point. I mean, it's an intuition that I share that having a psychedelic experience or different kinds of psychedelic experiences would just make you a more effective guide for others. That will be part of the evaluation that we do, but the reality is there's been no controlled studies on that up till now. There really hasn't been any opportunities for people to have legal, recognized, so we will be doing that, but yeah. Yeah, the question is about the certification itself. So it's a certificate granting program. It's not a degree granting program. And it's housed at UC Berkeley, but it's not, we don't have the same admissions and enrollment process that someone who's an undergraduate major or a grad student at Berkeley would have. So it's a certificate. And that is all of the training programs that exist. Actually, that's their model as well. So Dee, I wonder, we're running short on time. What do you recommend?
Get through the start Q&A.
Okay, we'll do that.
I was going to say I am absolutely fascinated by your narrative and whether or not we were going to have question and answer statements later because it gets interrupted and
Yeah, so to clarify, there is a dedicated period of questions and answered afterwards. So maybe I will go through the rest of my slides briefly, and then I obviously, the question and answer is the part of this that's actually fun and unique, as opposed to watching me give this talk on a video or something. So, okay, so very quickly about the training program. As mentioned, these are people who often have religious and spiritual care backgrounds, but could also be social workers or healthcare professionals, but they all are really established in their fields. Our third pillar is public education and journalism. You probably recognize the guy on the left, and probably the guy on the right for a lot of you too. So Michael Pollan and David Ptsd are leading this. We really see that our center as filling a big hole in, we're all inundated with information, but it's actually hard to get reliable scientific-based information on psychedelics even now. And so our website is here, psychedelics.berkeley.edu. That has information about a whole bunch of different topics: risk reduction, the legal issues, cultural issues, biological. So I recommend any of you check that out for different kinds of explainers. And then we have a newsletter, The Microdose, comes out every week. All right, so all this laughter indicates that maybe we don't have as many subscribers in the room as we would like. So I encourage you all to subscribe. It's free, of course, and every week you get kind of just news updates in the field and then also an interview with someone in the field who's influential. We also have the Ferris UC Berkeley Psychedelic Journalism Program. So the idea here is that journalists who are practicing submit proposals for doing investigative pieces, and then if they are successful, they get awarded funds to be able to carry out these more substantive journalistic pieces and then publish them wherever they can. And so the very first publications from our first cohort are just coming out now. And then finally, we are starting next month filming on a massive online course, Psychedelic Science 101, and that will just be more content than is on our website, certainly, and then lectures, interviews, and so forth with a variety of experts in the field of psychedelics. So that's I didn't spend as much time on it, but certainly it's a huge part of our center is these public education efforts. I want to say a little about the core values of our center. One is open science, and this is especially important with many different players coming into the field. some of whom are really just looking to make money from it. And so our work is intentionally for the greater good, for the common good. And one part of that is that whatever we discover will be for everyone. So we as a center, and many of us individually in the center, have signed the Statement on Open Science and Open Praxis. And we commit to placing the common good above our own individual gain or even our center's gain. Share the research with the public, no firewalls or subscriptions to be able to get to our research results. And that we're not looking to commercialize or to have intellectual property that would restrict access to any of the discoveries of our research. And this has led to some tricky conversations. We've had companies who've come to us offering to support our research projects that I just described. No strings attached, but it's clear that what the reasons that they're doing this are not well aligned with the reasons that we're doing it. And so we've been fortunate to have other kinds of donors that have been not so ethically fraught, but it's a really complex space right now. And so I think it's important for anybody in this kind of work to really be clear about their priorities and their reasons for engaging in the work. And related to that, our core values also include a commitment to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as reciprocity. So as I mentioned, there's been a huge problem in the field that almost all the research studies are not representative of the society they're in. They tend to be white, they tend to be more educated, they tend to be more wealthy. This is also going to be a huge problem if these get approved as medicines, especially if health insurance isn't covering them. It's only going to be available to those people who can afford this very expensive, complicated treatment. So we are trying on basically all levels to make the groups that we work with and interact with as representative as possible. That includes our center itself, the members of the team, the researchers, the therapists, the journalists, and so forth. It also involves our recruitment, as I mentioned before, strategies for recruitment of the participants in our research studies, and then in our training program curriculum. So one way we've increased diversity among our trainees is we have a scholarship program to enable people who might have trouble paying the tuition of the program to be able to enroll. But also there's so much value and knowledge from Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous traditions and knowledge. We are, when appropriate, trying to incorporate that into the training program, being mindful that there's also issues of cultural appropriation and being extractive and taking knowledge that a group has that doesn't necessarily want to share it with the world through the BCSP and its activities. So trying to be thoughtful and mindful, but still understanding that the Indigenous perspectives have been really overlooked and pushed to the side in many of these conversations about psychedelics. And so many people just kind of think the West discovered psychedelics in the 1950s, and it's just really not the case. This is also true in our public education offerings. So if you look at the people we've interviewed, for example, in the microdose, we're really trying to get a really broad range of perspectives there. As we move into sort of our online course, maybe a podcast eventually, this will be a way for us to be able to center Indigenous voices. And then we are working with consultants who are experts in DEI to make sure that we're doing this in a mindful and thoughtful way, and also getting advice about how to start building reciprocal relationships with Indigenous groups. So we can have the best intentions and want as a center to be able to have meaningful, balanced relationships with Indigenous groups and to be able to mutually teach and learn from each other and benefit each other, but which groups and which individuals and which groups. And so it's we're mindful that there's many ways that the people with good intentions have misstepped and done harm before. And so we are going slowly, but very committed to this. And what we can start with now that's pretty straightforward is that 10% of the funds that we get from donors for our center that's not restricted or assigned to a particular project are set aside for us for DEI and reciprocity work. And so our center's been pretty successful at fundraising, so this is enough resources to be able to hire a full-time staff member who can really just focus on this and be our expert in our center. And will then engage with the researchers and the people doing the training program and the journalists to be able to advance DEI and reciprocity. And it's also enabled us to found this program of Indigenous Research Student Fellowships, which is for UC Berkeley undergraduates and grad students from historically marginalized communities or people who are working in areas that are related to reciprocity and equity in psychedelic spaces. Here are our first wonderful cohort of our Indigenous Research Student Fellows. And it was so inspiring to see the creativity and ambition in some of their project proposals. So we're really excited. This will be there'll be a new group of fellows every year, and we're really excited to see what comes out of the work that the center's supporting. And then finally, just a little bit about how we are able to do all these programs. So it really is all individual and foundation gifts to us. And that's true for all of the psychedelic work. Even the work that's happening in medical schools for clinical trials, that's actually 98% of it is being funded just by the generosity of individuals and groups. Because of the stigma around the war on drugs, primarily, there's been almost no funding from the government. So normally, if there's mental health research being done, it's supported by the National Institute on Mental Health, and they get research grants, and that helps to support the research. That seems to be coming. There's indications from the National Institutes of Health that they do want to start supporting this kind of work, but everything up till now has not been that model. It's been this philanthropic model, so we're very grateful as a center for all of the donors that have stepped up and helped us to get this center off the ground. And we want to continue growing in this area. We want to expand into the social sciences and humanities. You've probably noticed that's not really well represented in our center right now. And then certainly continuing to build on our strengths as well. And having the gifts that we have enables us now to hire permanent staff members. Up till now, it's really been me and the other faculty members kind of doing this almost on the side together with our regular lives as professors. And so our first major hire was our executive director, Imran Khan, who's shown here. And he is now then starting the process of hiring many other staff members to really be able to take a lot of these ideas and implement them into actual programs and activities. And there I will stop, and thank you for your attention. Okay, and now we'll take some more questions, please.
Yes. I have a very strange experience. I had taken psilocybin twice, and the mushrooms, and I had a high dose, no effect at all. Let me give you a little background.
Yeah, we get that.
Yeah, no, it's going to be a minute. Basically, I got my Ptsd specifically about 50 years ago. Started having insomnia. This got worse about 20 months ago. I couldn't sleep at all with any medication. I did transmagnetic stimulation.
Well, sorry to interrupt. Maybe this question is better addressed with just you and me afterwards, and then we'll give everyone else a chance to ask as well. All right, let's do that. Yes? Interesting. The question is if the FDA and other government agencies make it really difficult to do this work in the US, do we consider maybe outsourcing some of it or conducting in other countries? Many countries have really followed the US's lead in the war on drugs and the legal restrictions. I think for us, so much of our center is based on the expertise that we have here at Berkeley in study design and very technologically advanced equipment and so forth. So we haven't really seriously considered, but for other things like a clinical trial that's more kind of just based on collecting safety data and efficacy data, I think that would be realistic, but not something that we'd be involved in as a center. Yes? Yeah, so there's a mention on one of the slides of existential stress, I think, associated with an end-of-life diagnosis. And so there's been work on just receiving a terminal diagnosis, obviously is a really profound event, often induces anxiety in people, and to some of them it's at the level where they seek out treatment from mental health providers. And so there's been work on psychedelic-assisted therapy to help people to manage or to just have different perspectives on whatever issues arise for them, confronting their own mortality in this way. Why, so many hands I don't know how to pick. How about in the far back? Question is, are we only planning on using mushrooms or maybe moving into other plants, animal substances? So we're really restricted to using pharmaceutical grade chemicals in the current landscape. The DEA would, I think, have a hard time approving growing mushrooms and then using those, and the FDA would have a hard time with us using that as a medicine. So we are interested in other compounds such as ketamine and MDMA and so forth, and intellectually very interested in differences between the isolated compound and the organisms that they come from, but that's pretty far in the future, I would say, for us and really anyone in the US. Yes, in the back. The question is there any possibility in the high-dose studies to do group experiments and not just individuals? Some people on our team have actually have experience with that in the context of clinical trials, and we've talked about it a lot, but our initial designs were basically starting simple and small, hopefully building a foundation about how we get our regulatory approvals. But it is something that we're interested in examining in the future, but it's not in any of our protocols right now. Yes?
For the cellular and molecular level research, are there any working hypotheses or findings as to what the mechanisms are?
Question is about, for the cellular molecular work, are there particular hypotheses about what the mechanisms are? So we definitely know that there's a common site of action for many psychedelics, which is the serotonin type 2A receptor. And that has a particular localization in the brain, and there's certain neurons that are mediating activity. So the idea is the psychedelics are binding to this receptor that normally binds the neurotransmitter serotonin. And so that's one kind of anchor to start looking at different kinds of effects. But Andrea's experiments on RNA splicing are very much about describing the variety of genes that are changing their RNA splicing patterns after psychedelics, and then identifying those as potential targets for mechanism and eventually for treatment. So you can kind of go in a more hypothesis-driven way based on a little bit we know, or you can also go in a data-driven way to collect that basic information that then leads to more hypothesis-driven research. And so we'll be doing some of both of those. Yes? Yeah. Have you done research with ketamine for depression? We have not. But there's a lot of work going on there, and there's a lot of clinics where people are getting ketamine treatment, and some of those are study sites as well. But we don't have any experience in our center with that. Yes?
What therapeutic models are you using in your research and training? And also, in your research, how do you measure or take into account the relationship between the therapist and the participant, and how that might affect the psychedelic experience?
All right, weighty questions. So one question was about what are therapeutic models in our training program, and the relationship and research, and the relationship between the therapist or the guide and the participant. So I would say our training program, first of all, our training program is 3 days old, and so it's very much a work in progress. So there's a very solid curriculum plan, but as I mentioned, part of this is that we'll be doing this evaluative research as we go, and so we'll be explicitly testing different therapeutic models and which ones make the most sense to include in our training program going forward. Our training program is fairly unique in its emphasis on spiritual care. So most of the training programs are really done kind of together with this clinical approach, where you're training therapists to be working with people with mental health diagnoses. And so we have some healthcare professionals in our program, but the emphasis is much more on spiritual care, and then really trying to look at a variety of perspectives, including many indigenous perspectives, and not deciding, because no one really knows, like, this is the therapeutic model that's going to be effective. So we're trying to kind of provide our trainees with many different models that they're able to then incorporate. What do I mean by spiritual in this context? A very broad definition. So we have chaplains as our trainees, ministers, other people in different kinds of religious communities. So I don't know if I could give a really one-size-fits-all definition, but not considering the psychedelic experience as something that's purely just chemical processes in the brain, but incorporating the spiritual dimensions, and which can look very different for people depending on their orientation that way. Yes?
What are possible adverse effects, and how common are they? And might your research help figure out who's susceptible to having those adverse effects?
The question is, what kind of adverse effects are they? How common? And could our research maybe shine some light on that? So there is a documented risk of increased psychosis after psychedelic experiences, and it seems particularly for people who are predisposed to psychosis. And so that's often an exclusion criterion for a lot of these studies, which means they're not being studied by definition. But obviously, we feel a tremendous responsibility for the safety and well-being of our participants, as do everyone who's working in this field. And so the solution so far has been to have inclusion and exclusion criteria that make it more likely that someone won't have an adverse experience of that kind. But it ends up meaning that it's understudied exactly what is going on with those people who are prone to adverse experiences and what happens with them. And I guess it depends a little bit what you mean by an adverse experience. I mean, there's many people who report having a bad trip that is excruciating and difficult for them, and maybe has really long-lasting consequences that wouldn't necessarily show up as a medical diagnosis, but you could consider that an adverse effect and a risk as well. And so, certainly in the context of our studies, that's why we have these preparation sessions with the trained facilitators, and then a lot of support during the experience, and then a lot of follow-up as well to make sure, in part, that everyone's doing okay and is being cared for. Yes?
I'd just like to say thank you to the whole team here for boldly bringing so much research and credibility to an experience that so many of us in the public have had a profound experience, and really helped to enlighten us and spread credibility. So thank you all for all your hard work.
Oh, thank you. I'm very happy to repeat that comment, which is thanking us for bringing credibility and rigor to an area that is, really affects a lot of people in society, but has had so much taboo associated with it, and bringing, hopefully also what UC Berkeley as an institution represents to kind of bringing this into the light and studying it seriously, but also having honest conversations about it. Thank you. Yes? Question is, are neurodivergent folks? Yeah, so do we include neurodivergent folks? I think this would depend on your definition of neurodivergent. I mean, we are setting ourselves apart from the more medically oriented clinical trials that are looking for efficacy. In that case, they're actually screening for a particular diagnosis. We are trying to find basic mechanisms that generalize very broadly, and so in the big picture, that would include neurodivergent people as well, but realistically at the beginning we're looking for a more homogeneous, simpler population to be able to look for common mechanisms and then extend that beyond. Yeah. Yes? Do we currently have plans to collect data on DMT? We don't. DMT is dimethyltryptamine, so it's a naturally occurring tryptamine. It's one of the active components in ayahuasca, for example. Super fascinating. As I mentioned, it's an endogenous neurotransmitter, so it's actually created by our neurons, and the signaling in the brain that it accomplishes is totally unknown. So fascinated by it for sure, but we're just starting with psilocybin in part because there's this strong connection with the clinical research, and then also there's a practical aspect. Some of the psychedelics have a very long period of action, not DMT, but it's a bigger ask for the participants and for the session monitors and medical monitors and facilitators to stay with someone throughout an LSD experience and into the night afterwards. And so there's these sort of pragmatic considerations as well about which compounds we're starting with. Yes?
Your research seems to impact directly on philosophical questions such as the nature of consciousness and free will. Are you going to be reading in professional philosophers?
The question is that there are all these philosophical implications or questions that are raised by working in this area about the nature of consciousness, and totally agree with that. And we would very much like to incorporate scholars in the humanities, including philosophers, into our center. So this is something we're actively working on, trying to find donor support for a more systematic program that would actually support scholars in the humanities and social sciences investigating these issues. Yes, in the back. The question is about for many people, it's important and meaningful to experience connection with nature, to have the psychedelic experience in a natural setting, and to what extent are we kind of bringing that into our center. So we are very restricted in terms of the location in which we can do this by all the government agencies, and I'm not even saying that as a bad thing. It's for safety reasons. It's important to have a space that is comfortable and protected and so forth. But the reality is that nature connectedness is something that's been established as a long-lasting effect of the psychedelic experience for people. And so we're interested in studying that in a kind of scholarly way, but I don't think there's no, in the far future, perhaps we'd be able to actually can do psychedelic research in a more natural environment, but no time soon. I will say that that's a part of our training program is not having people do psychedelics in nature, but looking into what is known about how psychedelics influence people's notions of connectedness with nature, and how to then, because some of these facilitators, they may well have the opportunities to guide people in more natural settings. And so it is something we're really aware of. We see how important it is for so many people, and so to the extent that we can, in the kind of with the current framework, we are trying to incorporate that. Yes? Question is that as an undergraduate at Berkeley and MCB specifically, how could you get involved in the center? This is shifting as the center grows and continues to take on more projects. I would say the first thing that anyone should do is to consult the Undergraduate Research Apprentice Program, URAP. And so when we have opportunities for research assistants for undergraduates, we will post them there, and then there's just a standard process of submitting an application and so forth, and then obtaining course credit for the work that you do. I think that we're going to try to be consistent about having the opportunities kind of centered there so that we don't have the situation where somebody has more opportunities just because they happen to know someone, or so that's a way of kind of standardizing and hopefully improving equity. So the URAP program is where I'd start. Yes? Correct. The URAP program has call for applications every semester, and it's not about our center at all. It's in many different research groups across our campus that are wanting to work with undergraduate research assistants. They just post different project descriptions, and then the undergraduates look through whichever's available and apply to the ones that they're interested in. So this is a well beloved long program at our university that we're just kind of tapping into. Yes. All right, so 2 questions. The first is, how do I feel about companies trying to patent the psychedelic integration process specifically, or yeah. So there's so many patent claims, and arguably some of these patent claims are really not novel. They're companies trying to get intellectual property on things that have really been established before, but once there's intellectual property, then there's licensing rights and the opportunity to make profits from it. So I'm concerned about that, and it's, the companies that are doing that generally have a lot of resources and the ability to be involved in long legal fights and so forth, and so I am somewhat sympathetic to the idea, though, that some people say the way to get these drugs as medicines, at least, to a wide variety of people is through companies. That's the way it works in our country, and there's no exception to that so far for pharmaceuticals. So to the extent that a company is kind of taking that path in order to improve equity and access, I think that could be a good for society, but I fear and believe that many of these companies, that's not where they're coming from. They're really seeing it as an opportunity for capital and investment. And then the second question is about, there's a movement, I would say, within our field to try to develop psychedelic drugs that have all of the benefits for mental health, but don't create a psychedelic experience. There's no trip. And there's an equity kind of argument to be made there as well, saying, well, it's so expensive to have all the therapy and all the oversight. Wouldn't it be great to just take a pill before you go to sleep and then you wake up and you don't have your anxiety problem or your depression problem anymore? And then others are really offended by that. They say that the subjective experience is the power of the psychedelic, and there's no way to take that out of it and still have anything that's effective. My view is that's a scientific question, and the data will tell us eventually. And we can make guesses about what we think, but I believe that some of those people who are doing that, their heart really is in the right place. They're trying to find a way to make this less expensive. The healthcare system in our society is going to leave a lot of people out in the current model with all of the therapy and oversight that's required. And this might be a way to reduce people's suffering in a broader way that includes more people. Oh, okay, right on. Yes? The question is there an emphasis on relational trauma, including PTSD, in our training program? Training and research. I would say not in our research. It's a component of our training, but I think therapists, clinical psychologists who are particularly interested in PTSD and trauma would probably be better served by going to a training program that is more within the world of medicine and medical practice, and ours is more emphasizing spiritual care and also psychedelic experiences that are outside of the mental health care world. Do we work with the concept of spiritual emergencies? I don't know. I wish Tina were here to answer. So in our research, no, that's not a concept that's in our, our brain imaging protocols and so forth, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were something that was a part of the training program, but as I said, this is a brand new program, and I'm still becoming familiar with the details of the curriculum myself, so I really don't know the answer. Yes? Do we have any hypotheses that we seek to prove in the beginning of the research and training? I would say we have hypotheses we seek to test. So certainly, when it comes to predictive coding and how that happens in the brain, we can make very particular predictions about brain areas and circuits and modes of information processing. So those hypotheses come along with their own predictions about what the kind of patterns of results that we'll see. For the training, I guess, the people who have developed the training curriculum, I think, in a sense, have hypotheses about what components of the training program they think are most important. And then the evaluative process year by year will give us real data about whether those come true or not. So certainly someone like Andrea has specific hypotheses about the biological changes that she will see. But basically the psychedelic research, especially in humans, there's been almost none of it until these clinical trials got going. And so in the meantime, neuroscience has undergone this massive revolution in tools and techniques and models for studying the brain, and none of them have been applied to psychedelics. And so it's an embarrassment of riches. There's so many questions that we can ask with modern technology, and there's also just this huge deficit of really basic knowledge about the actions of psychedelics. So a lot of the work is really starting at a very descriptive level and just characterizing what the effects are and then using that to develop more sophisticated hypotheses.
How about one more question before you guys will have a chance to come talk to Michael, but why don't we do one more question?
Okay, yes. Questions about Timothy Leary's research and to what extent we're incorporating that in So the questions about Timothy Leary's research. He's a very complex figure in our field. He did do some, I think, very important research and made some important discoveries that are very relevant today. He also skirted or crossed a lot of ethical boundaries about who participated in his studies and the scientists who were doing the studies taking psychedelics alongside the participants they were studying, and definitely issues about the rigor of his objectivity about the research. He also has popularized psychedelics undeniably, but also contributed to the backlash from the government response in the way that he talked about psychedelics. So I will say there's a speech that he gave in San Francisco years and years ago, and he predicted there would be a dean of psychedelics at Berkeley someday. So we might be on the path to realizing that.
Maybe your study could definitively answer that question. Is Timothy Leary dead?
All right, before we give a round of applause, I want to thank Michael Silver from the bottom of our hearts by giving him this Science at Cal shirt. So thank you, Michael. And our volunteers all have different Science at Cal shirts on, and they are on sale for donation for $20. If you'd like your own Science at Cal shirt, they are at the booth as you exit. Again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your attention, for all of the amazing questions, and we hope to see you next month.